So this talk is going to cover some of the basics of pollination. I wanted to make sure that no matter where you're at with your knowledge on pollination and pollinators, there's a little something for everyone here. And then we'll get into the specifics about some research and some very specialized and fascinating and maybe unexpected pollinator relationships that have formed. This photo that I've used on my cover slide is a photo I took when I was in the Yukon for a BioBlitz in the summer of 2019. And true to the title, I wanted to include a photo with pollinators that aren't bees or birds, which are, you know, what we tend to hear about the most. So there's a picture here. There's a blue butterfly, and just below it by the antenna, you can actually see what looks like an ant. But this is actually a Gallus genus Ichneumon. So Ichneumon wasp is actually a wingless wasp. So all sorts of things will visit flowers because of the sugary nectar reward in them. And so there's a whole little universe there to explore. And we're going to get into that now, starting with some of the basics of pollination. So, of course, the very first thing we need to talk about is, well, what is pollination? And this diagram just shows the structure and anatomy of a flower with the male and the female parts illustrated here. And pollination is just very simply the moving of pollen grains from the male anthers to the female stigma. And what is happening here in general is a plant fertilization with a resulting embryo or seed. Now, to go even a step further back from that, not all plants produce pollen. So moss and ferns, they don't produce pollen at all. Their reproduction is a bit more complicated. So they don't do pollination per se. They have two distinct plant forms. There's the sporophytes, which are diploid, and the gametophytes, which are haploid. And the sporophytes produce spores that then become the gametophytes. And the gametophytes, that word has gametes in it because they produce sperm and eggs that will then fuse into a zygote that will grow into a sporophyte to start that cycle all over again. So when you're walking in the forest and you see a fern, what you're seeing is the sporophyte. The sporophyte is the larger and more obvious form. It's not very often that you can notice the smaller gametophytes that come from the spores. Now, the other groups of plants are Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. So Gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants, and Angiosperms are the flowering plants. Both produce pollen, but Gymnosperms produce pollen in their cones, whereas Angiosperms produce pollen in flowers. So of the plants that produce pollen, the major differences, which I started to speak about already, are the cones versus the flowers. And the actual meaning of the name with Gymnosperms, it means naked seed. So the resulting seed or plant embryo is, it's very sparse, it's small, and it doesn't have a fleshy covering. Whereas Angiosperms produce seeds, which is the result of the pollination, which has a fleshy covering. So fruits, nuts, that sort of thing. So that's the major difference between Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, which both produce pollen. Now, of flowering plants, why would a plant choose to flower when there's other means of reproduction? Flowering isn't the only way you can reproduce. This is sexual reproduction is what happens when plants flower or produce pollen. whereas many plants can also reproduce asexually. So think of a strawberry plant in your garden. It's capable of doing both. Asexual production results in a clone of the parent. And this is often more of a last-ditch effort when sexual reproduction isn't possible or hasn't happened. There are advantages and disadvantages of both. With asexual reproduction, you only need one parent. So if you can't find another plant to get pollen from, that's okay in sparsely populated populations of plants. It's more fitness for the individual if you're discussing fitness in an evolutionary sense, being that more of your genes are being put out into the population. When you reproduce asexually, only about half of your genes are being perpetuated, whereas when you reproduce asexually, 100% of your genes are being carried on to the next generation. On top of that, asexual reproduction is much faster. And so plants that reproduce asexually can usually reproduce a larger number of offspring in a shorter period of time. However, sexual reproduction, the big advantage, why would something reproduce sexually if it's more difficult and more costly to the parent plant, is because with sexual reproduction, you get genetic diversity because you're combining the DNA from the two parent plants. High genetic variation is very important because it facilitates adaptation. So that makes the offspring better able to handle changes in the environment, whether that's climate or disease. If everything has the same genetic makeup, if a plant is susceptible to a disease or a blight, then the entire group of clones will then be susceptible to it. So the name of the game with sexual reproduction is adaptability. So you're able to adapt to changes in your environment better that way. The disadvantage is that offspring are produced less and it requires two parents and it's more energetically costly. Now, getting into plants that flower to reproduce sexually, given that plants want to produce sexually and not self-fertilize. So if a plant is producing both male flowers and female flowers or flowers with both parts, how do they avoid self-pollinating or self-fertilization? So this demonstrates sometimes how plants can do this. So on some plants, you have hermaphroditic flowers. So that means they're sometimes called perfect flowers, where they have both the male and female reproductive parts. Some plants have just male flowers and female flowers, but they're on the same plant. That's a monoecious plant, which means one house. That's why there's the little kind of house structure drawn around the diagram here. And then other plants have completely separate male and female plants, and that's called dioecious, which means two houses. Now, within plants that have hermaphroditic flowers with both male and female reproductive parts, how do those ones avoid self-pollination? This is a large number of plants that you see in your garden and in nature have both male and female parts. And if they're to avoid self-fertilization, there's quite a number of interesting strategies that plants will employ. So dichogamy is when the different parts of the flower mature at different stages. So this way, say with proterangery, you have the male parts maturing first, so the pollen is released, but the female part is not mature and cannot receive the pollen at this point, and so you don't have to worry about self-fertilization. The opposite of that is protogyny, which is where the female part of the flower matures first. So this is just kind of a temporal disruption to prevent self-fertilization in plants. So fireweed, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, it grows on roadsides and disturbed areas. It is the territorial flower of the Yukon, probably because fire is such an important part of the ecosystem there. It grows absolutely everywhere. It's also a plant that colonizes disturbed sites because it has a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that can fix nitrogen in soil. So that's why it's able to move into habitats that other plants can't. And in doing so, they're actually fertilizing the soil when they do this. So fireweed uses protandry, where the male structures will release pollen while the female structures are not mature, and that's how they avoid self-pollination. Another strategy that plants will use is hercogamy. So hercogamy is different than dichogamy in that it's, instead of a temporal separation, it's a spatial separation between the male and the female parts of the flower. So it's quite obvious on the two, the left and the middle diagram. And so if the anthers are short or long, they're kind of not close enough to the female stigma in order to avoid self-fertilization. Now, this is a version of hercogamy called heterostyle. And this is an eggplant flower. So I'm sure if any of you grow eggplant, you're now going to be going out and staring at the flowers very closely because you may not have noticed this before. But this is a unique form of polymorphism where it's not within the same flower, but it's in actual individuals. So you'll have 2 or sometimes 3 morphologically distinct types of flowers. The flower doesn't change, but within a population, there's these different distinct types. They're called morphs. And on each individual plant, all flowers share the same morph. And so these differ in the length of the anthers and the stamens. So you can see the very, very short female stigma here with the red arrow pointing to it in the B square. And then on the bottom, it's much longer and it's protruding past the anthers. Now, the morph phenotype, it is genetically linked to genes responsible for a unique type of self-incompatibility. So on top of having these physical differences, they are genetically unable to fertilize themselves, no matter what the circumstance. And so if the pollen from a flower on one morph cannot fertilize another flower of the same morph, so even if they're 2 different plants side by side, if they're the same morph, they will not fertilize each other. You need the different morphs together in order to get fruit. So it's very much kind of like a lock and key. And that's why some plants, you need to grow more than one in order to get fruit. You can't just grow one in your garden and expect. Now, some greenhouses have bred different cultivars Traditionally, tomatoes were not able to self-fertilize, but some of the newer varieties are capable of self-pollinating. So we as humans have found ways around it at times in order to get these plants to self. Now, different methods of pollination are seen in nature within the same habitat. So you have the major difference being abiotic and biotic. Abiotic just means not animal related. So you get water, and that even includes rain. So on the bottom far left, I have a picture of an orchid, which is actually pollinated by rain. The rain droplets hit the flowers and the pollen is ejected. And so the wind isn't strong enough to do this. It's got to be rain. And then there's also water pollination, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Think about things that flower underwater. Yes, there are things that flower that live underwater. How do they perform pollination? And then we have biotic pollination. So insects are the most common. We also get birds, thinking about hummingbirds that like to visit flowers. In the old world, you get things like sunbirds that pollinate flowers. And then you get things like bats. And then in some kind of more special cases, you get rodents, you get marsupials, and you even get things like reptiles doing pollination, all of which I'm going to go into more detail coming up. So on the bottom here, I have pictures kind of illustrating these different methods, whether it's wind in oak trees, wind in wheat, insects. We have there a picture of a sweat bee on yarrow. We've got the hummingbird visiting a phacelia. You have a bat on agave. So if you like to drink tequila, you can thank bats for that. And then you have an elephant shrew visiting a little short growing flower on the ground there. So more about water pollination. Eelgrass is a aquatic plant. It's an important habitat for many animals in the ocean. It's the thing that lots of manatees like to eat. Lots of sea turtles will eat eelgrass. And like all grasses, it flowers and it needs to be pollinated. And so you have very distinct forms here. And you can actually kind of think of eelgrass as being kind of a combination of water and wind pollination, because the water will bear the male, they grow their flowers in these huge inflorescences, but then the individual flowers break free from the male inflorescence that are near the base of the plant, and they drift up to the top of the water. And then once they're on the top of the water, the wind will blow them across the surface film. And the female flowers are tall and sit on these long stalks right at the surface. And the female flowers produce a little bit of a kind of a dip or a divot in the water, the way they're shaped. And they have this waxy covering so that they're not, they don't get bogged down or damaged by the water in any way. And that's what helps create that kind of dip in the surface tension as well. And then the male flowers float across the surface and are drawn into this divot in the water. And so that's how eelgrass kind of does a bit of a combo of water and wind pollination here as they drift across the surface once they float up top. Wind pollination, I have tree allergies and I have trees and wind pollination to thank for that. So early in the spring, many trees, like for example, alder and birch would do this. So you're seeing catkins. Catkins are male flowers. And there's also female flowers that are much more inconspicuous. And so they flower early in the year before the leaves come out, because the flowers want to be able to catch the wind without interference from the leaves. And so the flowers are emerging before the leaves in order to take advantage of that wind. And so the catkins will release the pollen to the wind, and it's carried to the smaller female flowers. And I think a lot of people associate flowers as being female, but as we've seen here, sometimes the male flowers are much bigger and obvious. Sometimes you have both within the same structure. So flowers aren't necessarily a female thing. Wind pollinated flowers also have a very different morphology than animal pollinated flowers. They don't need to be showy because they're not trying to attract anything. They don't need to have a smell. Again, they're not trying to attract anything. They're just catching the breeze. And so they have a long filament, and the pollen is loose on the end of it. And that way it's easier for it to catch a breeze and to shake and to vibrate in the wind. And then the stigma shown at the bottom of this diagram tends to be very feathery and have a large surface area because the pollen isn't being delivered in a very precise way. And so the female stigma needs to have that large surface area to kind of take advantage and catch as much pollen and as much surface area as it can to catch the wind. And so, as I kind of hinted at in the previous slide, abiotic pollination can be a little more precise because you're having something vector that pollen in a more kind of intent way, and it's not just being released into the air. And within biotic pollinators, all the various types from bees to squirrels and bats, you can have pollinators that are specialists and pollinators that are generalists. And so on the left here, there's a good example of a very specialized pollinator. So this is Darwin's orchid. And for many years, we didn't know what the pollinator was, but Darwin had postulated that it would be a moth with a very, very long proboscis. And it wasn't until after he had been gone for a long time that the pollinator was actually discovered. And sure enough, this flower has a very, very long tube or spur that the nectar is contained in. And so only something with an incredibly long tongue like this hawk moth here is capable of reaching it. And so it's excluding most other pollinators in that sense. So it's a very specialized relationship. And the hawk moth is called Morgan's hawk moth. And it's got one of the longest tongues of any insect in the world. And then flowers that are visited by generalist pollinators tend to have a much more kind of accessible shape to them. So this is a picture I took in Yellowstone National Park. It's of a Milbert's tortoiseshell on a yellow arnica flower. And so these flowers are shallow, so it's not like a deep area that the insect needs to access the nectar or the pollen. And on top of that, the flower is quite broad, and so it essentially forms like a little landing pad, making it easy for insects to land, to rest. They don't have to hover like that moth. And so it's a much more generalized shape for a generalist pollinator. Another way that flowers kind of can choose or guide pollinators, nectar guides are a morphological structure. So they can be visible like on these pansies where there are lines going to the center of the flower. And it basically acts as kind of a bullseye. And so they radiate out from the area and act as a visual signal to pollinators here's where the nectar and the pollen are. And so it's, you know, they're kind of trying to make it easy for them. They're not always visible. And so the two photos on the right, you have Black-Eyed Susan and you have a monkey flower, a mimulus. And the second photo on the far right is showing it under UV light, whereas the image in the middle or on the left is showing it under regular light. And so insects and birds are both capable of seeing in the infrared, or sorry, ultraviolet. And so here, even flowers that may not look like they have nectar guides, biologists have put them under UV lights. And in fact, they have this dark nectar guide towards the center in order to act as another level of a visual cue for pollinators. So as with, I was saying with specialist relationships, flowers have evolved with pollinators, and many flowers have evolved a certain set of traits that are associated with different groups of insects. And so there's often kind of these commonalities. These aren't 100% true all the time. And as I said, there are flowers that are just trying to attract anything they can. But it's interesting because things that are trying to attract bees or wasps tend to be white or yellow or violet. They produce nectar and they have nectar guides, and they often have an odor that the insects can detect with their antenna as well. They have sticky pollen that will then stick to the bodies of the insects, and they have a shape that's shallow or tubular that's easy for the insect to climb on. Things that are beetle pollinated, beetles aren't particularly attracted by color, so they're often just white or green. There's no nectar guides. They don't even always contain nectar because beetles can't sip or lap up nectar. They have mouth parts that are for chewing. And so they're just going after the pollen. They're not going for nectar here. Sometimes the smell will be foul or kind of smell like rotting fruit. They tend to contain lots of pollen because, again, beetles are going for pollen, not for nectar, like bees and wasps. Flowers that are attracting butterflies are often red or purple, and they also have nectar guides present. They produce lots and lots of nectar because butterflies and moths have those long tongues that they use like a straw to suck up nectar. And so you'll find lots of nectar present in these, not as much on the pollen side. They often have a large landing pad because butterflies and moths do tend to be larger. So something easy for them to land on. And sometimes they'll have the nectar contained in quite a narrow tube because, again, they have that long, long tongue where they can access that, whereas other insects wouldn't be able to. Moths are a little bit different from butterflies. Moths tend to be more so night flyers as opposed to day flyers. The flowers are often red or purple or white or pink. There's ample nectar, and they often have a very strong, sweet odor because if they're flying at night, they're going more off of scent than by visual cues in order to find their flowers. And often that odor is stronger at night as well. They often also have tubular flowers and a big landing pad for their pollinator. And now onto flies. So flower flies, you may have seen them in your garden. They're often mimicking bees or wasps. They often have black and yellow stripes on them. And they're out during the day and they're visiting and hanging around flowers, and they're hovering as well near flowers quite a bit. They're very diverse and they can trick even the most seasoned entomologists. There's some that are amazing mimics. I'll show you in a slide later on. So they can be a little bit hard to tell apart from bees and wasps. They tend to go for flowers that kind of are similar to bees and wasps because they mimic them in a lot of ways. So again, white, yellow, violet. However, they often have sticky pollen as well to get stuck to their bodies because, again, they're acting a lot like bees and wasps do. And last, you get things that are pollinated by filth flies, which is not a very flattering name, but those are the sorts of things you think of as, you know, house flies, or those green or blue bottle flies that are kind of visiting, you know, waste or compost or things like that. And flowers that are trying to attract that type of pollinator tend to be pale or dark brown, and they often have no nectar at all and a putrid odor. So you may have heard of, you know, those giant Titan flowers that bloom at botanical gardens that are quite rare and tropical. They have that really, really foul scent, the corpse flowers. And that's because they're fly pollinated and they're trying to attract filth flies. And they can sometimes even have a complex system for trapping the flies in. And so it forces them to kind of fumble around and in order to get the pollen on their body. So they get almost like trapped in there. They have to like bumble around a bit, and then they find their way out, and then they'll carry the pollen with them as they go. Within a group of pollinators, you even get specialists and generalists. So I do talk a little bit about bees because that's more so my specialty. Within bee groups, they call it polylectic or oligolectic. So polylectic bees are ones that'll visit all sorts of things. Oligolectic bees will visit just kind of a select few, sometimes just one family, sometimes just one genus of flowers. And so here within this genus of bees, Andrena, those are mining bees. They're out early in the spring. They're often black and maybe a little bit hairy. So a lot of people don't realize these are bees. But there are oligolectic and polylectic species. And there was a research paper that was published that found that the oligolectic bees, the ones that were visiting less types of flowers, did not have as many sensory structures on their antenna. And when you think about it, they're more specialized, so they don't need as many structures because the types of olfactory or scented cues that they're honed into is quite narrow. And so these bees that were visiting more types of plants had way more structures on their antenna because they needed to be able to recognize more smells, basically. So you can really see how the flowers become specialized and the bees become specialized. These things have co-evolved together over millions of years. So now we're going to move on kind of from the plant side more to the pollinator side. And so, you know, what are the usual pollinators you think about when you think of pollinators? It's usually birds and bees. So I will touch on them briefly before I move on to the kind of stranger things. Bees and wasps are both in the order Hymenoptera. Flies are in the order Diptera, and butterflies and moths are in the order Lepidoptera. You can kind of, it might be intuitive that bees and wasps are similar to each other and moths and butterflies are similar to each other, and that's because they're in the same order. And then, of course, the other one many people are familiar with are birds, such as hummingbirds, like this rufous hummingbird that's seen here visiting our native ribes, red currant flowers, which are very popular because they're red and tube shaped, which is, you know, the pollination syndrome for hummingbirds. Now, you might be thinking, well, those bees looked a lot like wasps that you showed me earlier. They're black. How can I tell the difference between a bee and a wasp if they're just tiny little black things? Here's a little entomology sidebar for anyone who's keen on that sort of thing. The very somewhat pedantic answer to that, the technical one based on morphology, is that bees have this pronotal lobe. So on the front of the thorax, they have this little knob that kind of sticks out under their wing. And on top of that, which might not always be obvious to see, bees have hair on their body that are branched. And so they have branched hairs, whereas wasps don't have branched hair on their body. These branched hairs, when you think about a structure that is branched, it's almost like a feather. And so it's able to grab and pack and carry pollen. And so bees have branched hairs because they have evolved to collect pollen. So that's the more obvious difference, is behavioral. Bees collect pollen as their lifestyle, whereas wasps, when they're pollinating, it's more of an incidental thing. Bees feed their young pollen in order to develop, that's their protein source, whereas wasps feed their young, for lack of a better term, flesh. They're carnivorous. So they're feeding their young other insects, they're hunters. So they're also good to have in your garden because they're often controlling pests. They're killing caterpillars and things that are attacking your plants. But wasps are feeding their young flesh, whereas bees are feeding their young pollen for protein. So just to show you how hard it can be to tell these apart, I've also got here kind of the major points and the differences between them. But all three of these are quite similar looking, especially, you know, when they're not a big picture sitting still for you. You might not be aware, but the middle one is a bee. So yes, bees are not only black and yellow or just kind of plain black and boring looking, but they can be bright green and metallic as well. We have green metallic sweat bees here in the genus Agapostemon. And they seem especially attracted to yellow or orange flowers. So if you see something bright green on a flower, take a closer look. And if you see yellow pollen on its legs, that's a bee, not a fly. And so flies tend to have short antennae and really big bulgy eyes and skinny legs. And the other thing that's kind of hard to tell is that flies have 2 wings, whereas every other type of insect has 4. Bees have longer antennae and they have thickened legs because they have those fluffy hairs on them to collect pollen. And then they have 4 wings. Wasps also have long antennae. Again, they're closely related to bees, so they're quite similar, but they have skinny legs because they don't have those special pollen collecting hairs called scopa. And then they have 4 wings. And they can be hairy, but they just don't tend to be as hairy as bees, which are using those hairs to pack pollen and carry it back and forth. To add another group to the mix, here are 4 insects that might look very similar to you, but they're all very different from each other. So moths are also incredible mimics. We have these types of moths here. Last summer on the Whistler Bio Blitz, I caught one of these. I thought it was a hornet or a yellow jacket. Even when I caught it in my net, it was behaving, flying just like one. And it wasn't until I looked at it in my net that I realized I had caught one. And I was so excited because they're not common. And so they're all mimicking each other. And this is actually a form of mimicry called Batean Mimicry. And so, you know, the bee and the wasp are capable of stinging, but the fly and the moth are not. And so it's to their advantage to kind of fool things that might want to eat them into thinking that they can sting. And so when things mimic each other and some of them are kind of doing a false representation, that's called Batean mimicry. Now, why do we talk about bees the most when we talk about pollinators? This is just to kind of reiterate the point I said earlier. They're the largest group of pollinators because they specialize in collecting pollen. Other groups of pollinators don't do this. They're visiting flowers for food, but the pollen isn't integral to their life cycle. Bees are the only group that are like this. And so that's why we tend to talk about bees the most. Just a little plug, because of World Bee Day, there are over 450 species of bee in British Columbia, and there's over 20,000 in the world. So it is a huge group. They evolved from wasps, And then once they evolved this kind of niche, they just radiated outward into this huge amount of diversity. Don't get me wrong, wasps are also incredibly diverse, but yes, there are 20,000 species of bee in the world. And the one you tend to hear about the most is just one species, the honeybee. Now, here's where I do a little bit of a rant about honeybees. You may not realize honeybees tend to get the most attention, and they are certainly important pollinators, especially because they are so heavily relied on in agriculture, and they are the most widespread species of bee on our planet. And the reason they're so widespread is because we have basically domesticated them. And so I kind of like to describe them as the cows or the chickens of the insect world. So honeybees are native to Europe. So here in North America, they were brought over by European colonizers, and they're almost entirely dependent on humans, and they're heavily managed. So they're kind of essentially livestock. So in addition to them not being native and the fact that we do have so many native bees, it's important to keep in mind when you want to support bees that you want to support native pollinators. So honeybees, while being important in some settings, they do tend to outcompete our native bees for resources like nectar and pollen. And they also, because they are managed by humans and kind of trucked around in large densities, they tend to get disease outbreaks, and they can spread these diseases to our wild pollinators as well. And they also, on top of that, don't do as good of a job at pollinating as our wild bees do. So many of our wild bee species are capable of doing this type of pollination called buzz pollination, where they'll land on a flower. Bumblebees especially will do this. Sometimes you can even hear them doing it when they land on a flower, because they'll land and then they'll vibrate their wing muscles, and it will shake the pollen out of the flower. And honeybees aren't capable of doing this. A honeybee would have to visit a flower 4 times to deposit the same amount of pollen as a bumblebee does. And so on top of that, even though honeybees are used extensively in agriculture, many of our crops worldwide are using the wild bees in the environment, even though they're not really being accounted for. So there's a paper that came out in Science recently talking about how in more than 40 crops grown worldwide, wild pollinators improve the pollination efficiency and increase the fruit set by twice that honeybees do. And they're just doing that by being in the environment without being supplemented in any way. Many of our wild bees in particular, like bumblebees, are in decline, and yet they don't get a lot of attention or resources towards their conservation that honeybees do. But it's extremely unlikely that honeybees will ever go extinct because of their status as a highly managed and widely used livestock. They're about as likely to go extinct as cows and chickens. And so when you think about conservation, please try to think about all the wild bee species that are out there, because they're as wonderful and diverse, and they have evolved a very special relationship with our native plants as well. So I'm done my rant about honeybees. Moving on to wasps as pollinators. I kind of hinted at this before, but wasps, because they're not actually actively collecting pollen, they tend to be more incidental pollinators. You may not realize this, you might not want to get very close to a wasp, but they're quite hairy. This is a photo of Vespula Vulgaris. We don't actually have this species here in North America, but we do have many similar species. And they have a lot of hair on their body. And so they're visiting flowers for the nectar as an energy source. The adults don't actually eat flesh, it's just their young that eat them. So the adults get their energy by sipping nectar. And as they move from flower to flower sipping nectar, they'll get pollen stuck to them, and they'll move the pollen around as they do that. There is one special group of wasps that is a bit of an exception to that. So these are pollen wasps. They are a subfamily within the Vespidae family that hornets and yellow jackets are in. And they actively collect pollen and feed it to their young. We have this species here in British Columbia, Pseudomasera Vespoides. Now, because they don't have those special hairs that bees do, the way they collect pollen is they swallow it. And so they carry it back to their nest in their crop, and then they're regurgitating it for their young. Interestingly, there is also a species of bee that does this. So again, that line between wasp and bee can be a little bit blurry at times. The Hylaeus genus called masked bees, they don't have pollen collecting hairs on their legs, and so they swallow their pollen and then bring it back to their nest for their young to eat. However, there are certain circumstances where wasps are the main pollinator for a plant. It's not especially common that you get a wasp that this plant is dependent on. But here in the International Journal of Plant Sciences, a paper was published in 2006, and there's a milkweed plant in South Africa where they determined that spider hunting wasps were the obligate pollinator for the plant. And so the plant is actually self-incompatible, so it's not capable of pollinating or fertilizing itself. And when they offered the nectar from the plant to honeybees, they completely rejected it. And so they think that there are secondary compounds in the nectar that somehow repel other pollinators other than this one wasp species. These Hemipepsis pompilid wasps will readily consume the nectar. And when they do, you can see in the bottom picture, the pollinaria gets stuck kind of under their mouth. And then as they move from plant to plant, they will then deposit those pollinaria. And so this is kind of a rare circumstance where a wasp is the definitive pollinator for the plant. Another somewhat famous example are fig wasps. So wasps as well come in all shapes and sizes. These are tiny, tiny wasps. Figs are internal flowers. So when you see that kind of bulbous fruit, a fig is not actually really a fruit, it's a compound internal flower. And so these tiny wasps are able to access through the end of the fig where all other pollinators are excluded from these flowers. Figs have these enclosed inflorescences, and they're completely dependent on a pollen-bearing female to enter and pollinate the flowers. The males never leave the flower. She lays her eggs. And so the flower will either turn into a wasp or it will turn into a fruit. And so it's kind of a trade-off for the plant that when they emerge, they'll mate with the males. The males will never leave, but the females that mate will then leave and move to another fig and pollinate it. And so in order to avoid being overexploited by these wasps, if a wasp entering does not carry pollen on it, the fig will actually be aborted by the tree. And so it's almost like a little bit of an evolutionary arms race between pollinator and plant to exclude cheaters who aren't doing their job. Flies are another important group of pollinators. We have these flies here in British Columbia. They're bombilius bee flies. They have this long tongue for sipping nectar. They're very, very fuzzy. You can see how they would easily move pollen around. When they're visiting for the nectar to sip, they get the pollen stuck to their body, and then they're incidental pollinators, much like wasps are. A local plant that is fly pollinated, though not necessarily by that type of fly, is skunk cabbage. And it's called skunk cabbage because the flowers are quite foul smelling. And that's because they're trying to attract flies. just like how that earlier slide showed how fly pollinated plants often have a foul smell. Now, on top of those two types of flies, mosquitoes can be pollinators. And I think there's almost a universal dislike of mosquitoes, which I think is a little bit unfair because mosquitoes have a lot more to them than just blood sucking. So mosquitoes are important in the ecosystem because they're food for bats and birds, and as larvae for fish and other aquatic insects, but they can also be pollinators. And so only female mosquitoes will bite for blood, which they need to produce the eggs. And the males, other than mating, often just kind of hang around on flowers, getting nectar as an energy source. And so mosquitoes are fairly hairy as well, and they will pick up pollen on them. You can see on the left, the mosquito has pollen grains on its long proboscis, as well as on its legs and antenna. And so that's on tansy. And that photo is from an article written by a UBC entomologist who used to be at UBC, Dan Peach. And we actually did our undergrad together, and he's done a lot of his research looking at how mosquitoes have this whole other life and why they're attracted to both flowers and humans. In some cases, mosquitoes are the main pollinator for a plant. And so on the right, there's a picture of an orchid. It's the blunt-leaved orchid, which is found here and across Western North America. And you can see the flowers are just kind of green and not very big. And that's because the mosquitoes are responding to the scent as opposed to the color or the nectar here. So flower flies, as I was saying, are often are mimicking bees. So here's an assortment of flower flies. They can look quite a bit like bees with yellow and black stripes or being fuzzy. And what's interesting about them is that research is showing as other pollinators are declining, these are becoming more important, especially in disturbed and urban habitats. And so they are also important not only for pollinating, but as larvae, they will eat aphids. So they'll be predatory when they're young and then pollinators when they're adults. So they're kind of beneficial at all stages of their life. They can also be really important for recycling of organic matter in the soil, as well as doing long distance pollen transfer. They tend to fly further distances than bees. What's really interesting is there's some migratory species, and so they tend to leave in the winter. There's this paper here talks a lot about the UK, where they leave in the winter, and then you get millions that migrate back in the summer and provide these pollination services, especially in urban habitats. And having worked in a variety of habitats myself, from natural areas, from alpine to sea level, as well as urban parks, and even I've done some sampling on the Vancouver Convention Center green roof downtown. What you tend to see in these more urban disturbed areas is a lot of syrphid flies. And so we're going to go on to moths and talk about some of these special pollinator systems that moths have. Butterflies are more famous as in this group for being pollinators. So I actually wanted to talk about moths since they don't get as much attention. Moths can be day or nighttime pollinators. There are hummingbird, clear-wing hummingbird moths and hawk moths that fly during the day. People will think that it's a hummingbird because of the way they fly and hover, but they're actually a type of sphinx moth. Yucca moths here that I'm talking about are a famous example, which is kind of similar to fig wasps in that they have a mutualism with yucca plants. And so it's kind of a similar trade-off where the moth will lay its eggs in the flowers of the yucca plant, and then the larvae eat the seeds as they develop. And so the moth is visiting, it's pollinating, but then it's laying its eggs, which eat the flowers. So it's a pro and con simultaneously for the plant. And so how does the plant balance this mutualism? Well, the relationship is not so neat as just there being one moth species having evolved. There's been two separate events. You can see in this tree on the other side here, two of the species listed have a C in brackets beside it, and those are cheater moth species. And so this is two cases where there's been a reversal of the mutualism. And so these cheater moth species, instead of depositing their eggs into the flowers, they're depositing their eggs into the fruit. And since they're visiting when it's at the fruiting stage, they're completely bypassing the pollination step. And the reason this is advantageous to the moths is because the plant has a system where it can kind of abort the flowers if there's too many moth eggs on them. And so it wasn't necessarily an intentional thing that happened. There was just a shift in the timing of when these moths are laying their eggs. And it became a huge advantage to these moths because they're bypassing that stage where their eggs can just be ejected by the plant. And so it's a much, it's a seed resource that wasn't available to the other species of moth that were laying their eggs at the flowering stage. On to beetles. I love this picture because you can see all the pollen grains all over the beetle's head and its body. As I said earlier, beetles don't drink nectar. They don't have the appropriate mouth anatomy to do it. So they have chewing mouth parts. And so they go for the pollen. And so things that are beetle pollinated or that beetles are attracted to tend to produce abundant pollen. So here is a ornate checker beetle. It's a species that can be found locally. And what's interesting about this species, as you can see, it's quite hairy. And so it would easily pick up pollen on its body and move around. But this species consumes both pollen and pollinator. And so the adults feed on the pollen, but then they deposit their eggs on the flowers as they eat the pollen. The larvae hatch on the flowers, and then when a bee comes and lands on the same flower, the larvae will attach themselves to that bee and then get taken back to the nest of the solitary bee, where they'll hop off, go into the nest, and then consume the pollen and nectar that's been left for the bee larva. And then as a final indignity, they'll eat the bee larva. And so they're really taking advantage of all the things that a flower has to offer here. Based on fossil evidence, beetles are thought to have been some of the earliest insect pollinators. So magnolias are a great example of something that is thought is beetle pollinated, beetles being one of the most earliest pollinators, and magnolias being one of the earliest flowers to evolve. They're considered fairly primitive. And so magnolia flowers have very simple structures. They have no distinction between their petals and sepals. And that suits beetles just fine because they're quite clumsy and with pollinating, and they often end up eating parts of the flower in addition to the pollen that they're after. So not surprisingly, given that their mouth parts are designed for chewing, they end up doing a lot of damage to the flowers as well. The flowers have adapted to this by having leathery petals, thick petals, and they have seeds that are really well protected. And so moving on to non-insect pollinators, we have some strange pairings like in Mauritius, where there are flowers that produce brightly colored nectar to advertise to geckos. And here you can see on the right where the gecko is visiting the flower that has the yellow nectar, but it's not attracted to the one with the clear nectar. And another example where we have the ground produced flowers with the lizard visiting the green plain looking flowers. And then I love the expression on the lizard's face with the arrow pointed to it where it's got some pollen on its face, and that's in South Africa. Now, bats are an important pollinator as well. They tend to be common in tropical and subtropical ecosystems. Bats can be a expensive pollinator to supply. Bats are big, so you need to produce big flowers with lots of nectar to attract them. So why would a plant want to attract bats if they're so energetically expensive to produce flowers for? Well, the types of plants that are visited by bats tend to live in habitats that are very sparse, and bats are capable of flying long distances. And so bats are advantageous here because they're long distance dispersers. And bat pollination has evolved multiple times in multiple lineages. But again, it tends to be in tropical areas and in places with plants that are quite sparsely dispersed. Mammals are, non-flying mammals are also common in some more sparse habitats. They're not obligate pollinators because they're also eating parts of the plant and insects as well. But we've had lots of circumstances where you have things like elephant shrews in South Africa that are visiting flowers at night that grow close to the ground and are moving the pollen around as they do so. And somewhat, one of our last examples here, we have a large flower which grows in Southeast Asia. Now this flower is pollinated by squirrels, flying foxes, and bats and macaques. And this type of flower, I love this phrase, it requires explosive opening in order for the parts of the flower to be accessed. And so the wing petals need to be pressed down and the banner petal needs to be pressed up. And it's been shown that where this plant evolved, tree squirrels are the most common visitor for this large flower at night. So as you can see, pollination systems are incredibly varied and often highly evolved and quite specialized. And I just wanted to touch on a little bit of what happens when these systems are disrupted and what it means for plants and for humans. So here we have an example of a plant in Hawaii where the native pollinator, which was thought to be a moth with an extremely long tongue. You can see the flower is very long and narrow, so only something with a long proboscis would be able to access the nectar in it. This pollinator is now extinct in Hawaii, and because of that, the plant is now functionally extinct in the wild. So almost all of the plants that exist now exist in botanical gardens or are cultured at universities. It also grows in, or did grow when it was more abundant, in really rough habitat, volcanic plains and sea cliffs. And the thought is, you know, how do we conserve this plant if essentially it can never be introduced back into the wild in a way that it can grow and reproduce on its own? It will always need help being pollinated now, since its specialized pollinator is now extinct. And so is a plant like this worth trying to conserve? if its pollinator is now extinct. And for more of a human impact, besides plants, rare endemic plants going extinct, there's major impacts as well for our food and agricultural systems. And so this is a paper where in 2001, researchers had visited this county in China, where because high use of pesticides and overdevelopment of the land, there was not very many pollinators. They were mainly growing apple here because it fetched a really high price at markets. But apple, if you don't know, requires very special pollination systems where they have to be pollinated within 5 days of the flowers opening. They are self-incompatible, so they need a different type of tree to pollinate them. And so here on top of that, they hadn't planted enough of these pollinizer trees in the orchards because they were seen as being kind of a waste of space since they didn't produce fruit themselves. They were only producing pollen for the fruit producing trees. And so with that low proportion of pollinizing trees and not enough pollinators around, they were forced to resort to hand pollination here. And it was essentially seen as the best way to produce the apple crops. These researchers visited the same county 10 years later to see how they were coping with it. And essentially the farmers had to switch to an entirely different set of crops. They moved to plums, vegetables, and walnuts because they still were not able to reestablish the pollinator populations in the area that were required for the apple crops. And so there's impacts not only for our native plants, but also for food and for our agriculture systems as well. So that's the end of my discussion. I would be more than happy to answer any questions, and I can just leave my contact up. I would be more than happy for anybody to contact me. I love to talk about bees as well as pollinators or plants. And I would be happy to answer any questions you have now or in the future if you'd like to email me.